Let's go to our third question of the night, which comes from Jenny Rogers. Jenny, evening.
Hi, evening. The Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act comes into force in less than a fortnight. Police Scotland have pledged to investigate every reported hate crime that comes to their desk, even if it comes from a comedian and their act on stage. Have we gone too far?
Thank you, Jenny. This new legislation starts 1st of April. It will mean this public information campaign, you might have seen about this already, criminalising, threatening or abusive behaviour intended to stir up hatred against certain characteristics. Karen Dunbar, you're out on tour next month.
Aye.
Are you worried about this?
I don't think so, and that's partly because maybe of my brand of comedy. Mine's is a lot of my own stories about the past and things like that, so there's not a lot of dodgy stuff really that's involved in it. But what is dodgy stuff now? That seems to be moving all the time. The goalposts seem to be moving all the time in that. And I think there's levels of police and language that really strike a level of fear into me about where we actually go as a society. And we spoke about that earlier with, make history by having a Tory-free Scotland, and that now becoming something that's contentious to say. So I'll be interested to see, because I think the specific thing that's happening in it is if it stirs up hatred, and it's what actually denotes stirring up hatred. So I don't think it's as inflammatory as it's actually being made out to be, that you can't say anything anymore without the fear of getting arrested. But there is still, it takes sometimes a bit of a sinister turn about what can come out of somebody's mouth without them being locked up. That concerns me, because when you start policing language, then it feels like we've got to go underground to speak about things that we want to speak about. And I'm not necessarily saying any isms. I'm just talking about like life in general. See if you had a different idea for the narrative that was going on about COVID. Who were you talking to about that? You couldn't talk to anybody about that. You just had to go with the one thing. So, I mean, that's opening up a real can of worms there. But it's just an example of, that's no offending. That was no a hate crime or anything. Or is it? Would that be seen as that now, if you're not going along with what the popular narrative is?
John Nicholson, the Scottish Police Federation have voiced real concerns about this and what it's going to mean for their officers trying to police this. Do we need this legislation, or has it gone too far?
Well, of course, the Scottish police came out, the Police came out and said the story in the front page of the Herald was a load of nonsense. Do you know, when you've been around journalism or politics for a while, there's recurring themes, and I'm picking up, this is political correctness gone mad. Remember, we kept hearing that a few years ago. So this is now, we're hearing that all over again.
So why do we need this legislation then?
Well, because to pick up on the point about comedy, the kind of comedy that I like the best is comedy which punches up, doesn't punch down, which takes on power, makes fun and mocks the powerful, but doesn't mock or belittle people who are vulnerable. What this legislation does, and I'm no expert in the legislation, but my understanding of the legislation is it tries to protect vulnerable groups from hate. And we know the groups that are attacked. We've seen it this last week with Islamophobic comments, racist comments. We see it all the time with transphobic comments, with trans people at the centre of this terrible outpouring of hate. And as a gay man, I used to hear the most awful language used routinely, which fortunately these days is lessened. But we have a right to protect people from hate, and hate which stirs up hate. And it doesn't mean you can't talk freely and sensibly or be funny.
Who decides what is hate?
Well, I think we have to use a bit of common sense. We know when we hear hate, don't we? I mean, all of us know when we hear a hateful comment. We know instinctively that it is wrong. That's why we were so upset.
Do you know what a hateful comment
is? To Diane Abbott.
Do you understand
it was hateful.
There have been things, as a gay woman, there have been things that have been said to me that have been very detrimental, and some of them recently, by the way, which is a surprise, because I haven't experienced homophobia for a long time, but see, in the past 6 months, I'm hearing it creeping back in. And
would you report that as a hate crime?
It crossed my mind for one of the specific things that happened, but I went against it. And the reason that I went against it was I didn't want that publicity. So get your heads around that one. I didn't want to have to, Camden Bar, blah, 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 in case anything gathered with that. And then there was a pile on for and against. So that is a dangerous thing that I could find myself moving into the background with that and saying, just let it go. So I do agree with you, John, there'll be a lot of minority groups that are doing that, like just let it go, and that does need to be protected. But there is also what you said there, Stephen, about what denotes hate now seems to be that wide. You know, if you don't like somebody's shoes, you're going to get jailed for it. No.
Well, let's find out if the audience feel more protected
I like
because
them,
of
by
this.
the way.
Gentleman in the check shirt in the middle. Yeah, on you go.
As a point on it, every weekend during the football season, there's hatred every weekend. What's going to be done about that? There is racist, there's homophobic comments, there's mostly a rise in sectarian comments. Every weekend, it's certain teams. We know it happens. We hear it on the television. We hear it in the stands. Nothing gets done about it. The Scottish Football Authorities don't do anything about it. The police aren't doing anything about it. Who's going to do something about it?
Thank you. Liz Lloyd, we've been down that road with football and trying to limit hate in football as well, and that didn't work out terribly well. So is this legislation going to end up in the same place, do you think, with that?
No, I don't think so. That legislation was introduced by the previous SNP government, Alex Salmond, and I think, you know...
And failed.
And failed, and that legislation had its flaws. I think what we have here in this hate crime bill, there was a piece of work done by a very senior judge, Lord Brackadale, to look at the nature of hate crime legislation in Scotland and whether it was doing the job. And it's not just, you hate, what do we have, my shoes, so, you know, I report that as hate crime. It's not that. This is about Islamophobia. It's about homophobia. It's about attacking people with disabilities. It's about people with key characteristics, minority groups in our country who face abuse or who face crimes committed against them because of their race or religion or their sexuality.
Women not included in that, though.
Women are going to have a separate bill, and I'm very supportive of this, because this bill deals with minority groups. It deals with hatred committed against minority groups. Women are a majority in society, but yet we suffer misogyny constantly. The hatred against women, it doesn't sort of expose itself in the same way because it's just low level. It's there all the time. So there was a very serious piece of, again, a proper serious piece of work done. Baroness Helena Kennedy, eminent KC, was asked to go away and decide, should offences against women be in this bill, or should there be a separate bill of offences, misogynistic hate? And as far as I understand it, the government's currently consulting on that, and it should be introduced next year. But, you know, we have a rise in Islamophobia, we have a rise in anti-Semitism going on in our society. It feels a bit ridiculous to me that we have that backdrop, and yet we have politicians, some, saying, let's delay this, let's push it back. You know, we need to take action when it's there. If we just keep saying, oh, we'll do it, we'll do it, we'll do it. You've got this rise in homophobia that Karen's talking about. When do we say enough?
OK, all right, let me hear from the audience. Gentleman in the grey, top there.
I feel it's all good saying, let's bring in the legislation now, let's do it now. But what we've seen, particularly with Police Scotland, is drastically reduced resources. They're struggling with staffing. So it's all good on the headline saying, oh, we're going to deal with it. But then if you've not got the resources, the staff there to do it, all it is a headline to say, look what we've done. It's not actually going to be dealt with because they've not got the resources to deal with it. So it's just a headline. That's all it is.
I think you voted for this.
Yes.
How are Police Scotland going to enforce it?
So, first of all, just touching on the point that the gentleman just made there, is you're absolutely right. Tomorrow at the Scottish Police Authority, there is a paper going to the SPA saying that the pilot done in Aberdeen, where some crimes will not be investigated anymore, should be rolled out across the country. That includes robberies, burglaries, some assaults. And if we're saying we're not going to investigate those crimes whilst adding even more legislation on top, we aren't recognising the real stress and strains we're putting on our police service. And I stand voting for it. The point I'm making is, if we're not going to properly resource and train our police officers, and even the most basic crimes like burglary aren't going to be investigated, I can understand why people don't have confidence that this new law will give them the protections that they need. And actually, just touching upon that point, I actually think all three questions we've had today are connected. If you think about the broader question around language in our politics and how that pulls people apart, if you talk about the mental health impact on young people and the impact that has on their education and their life opportunities, if you talk about hate crime legislation, all of it is connected. Honestly, as someone that has a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, I honestly believe that we live in a more hate-filled world now than the one that I was growing up in. Hate crime is on the rise. Prejudice and hate in all its forms is on the rise. And how do we address it? Part of it is our legislation around our justice system. but actually the much more significant part is actually education. It's how are we teaching people to coexist, to respect, to learn from each other, and actually to have an equal stake in seeing success for every individual communities. And I just feel right now, where we're squeezing resources, we're not properly seeing those services in place, that we end up in these arguments and debates around divisive issues rather than actually outcomes. What are the outcomes in our country? The outcomes in our country is mental health issues are on the rise, young people aren't getting opportunity, hate crimes are on the rise, and we're investigating less crimes. Unless we address those 4 outcomes and have a positive answer to all 4, this has continued to spiral and get worse and worse for people.
Oliver Mundell, we all want to see a less hateful Scotland. Is this the way to do it?
No, it's not, because I don't think it tackles the underlying causes. And I think it's not just some politicians who've got concerns about the bill. We've heard from yourself, Stephen, and the gentleman in the audience. The many police officers and the Police Federation have concerns about how it's actually going to be enforced. And John talked before about common sense, but the law has to be clear, it has to be specific, and it has to be enforceable. And I have serious reservations about who exactly is going to decide where the thresholds are. There are some easy cases where you can definitely call things out as hateful, but there are a lot of things in grey areas, and this legislation doesn't provide that certainty, and I think it does start to impinge on freedom of speech. And I agree with Anas. I actually think the answer to much of this is in education. It is in changing societal attitudes. I think too often we heard about headline grabbing. Too often the Scottish Parliament, over the last 17 years particularly, has been about various First Ministers announcing various things in Holyrood and thinking because we pass a new law or we say we're going to be tough on something or we're going to get it fixed, that actually solves the problem. And all it does is make people more and more disillusioned about politics.
Okay.
We need to actually get to the bottom of these issues and do something about it.
Okay. The hashtag is BBC DN.